Hello, everyone. I'm Pastor Daniel Marva. Thank you for taking time to join this online Bible study. I invite you to open your Bibles in the book of Second Timothy, chapter 1, verse 12. That's Second Timothy, chapter 1, verse 12. Here the Apostle Paul writes, "For the which cause I also suffer these things. Nevertheless, I am not ashamed, for I know whom I have believed, and am persuaded that he is able to keep that which I have committed unto him against that day." Brothers and sisters, there is a difference between knowing about God and knowing God. You can know his name and not know his nature. You can know his word and still not recognize his voice. You can know what your pastor says about God. You can know what your grandmother says about God. You can grow up hearing testimonies about what God did for somebody else and still reach a moment in your life when somebody else's testimony is no longer enough. Because sooner or later, life will ask you a question that your mother's testimony cannot answer for you. Sooner or later, you will face something that requires more than just, well, my pastor said. Well, my church believes. Well, my parents taught me. There comes a moment when you have to be able to stand flat footed in the middle of your storm and say, I know him for myself. Here in what we read, Paul did not say, I know what I believe. He said, I know whom I have believed. His confidence was not merely in a doctrine. His confidence was in a person. He had walked with him too long, suffered with him too long, seen too much, survived too much, experienced too much for anybody to convince him that his God was not real. And I want to preach to you today on this topic, the God that I know. Well, many of us first met God through somebody else, and there's nothing wrong with that. Timothy knew God because, well, Louise, who was his grandmother, knew God, and then Eunice, his mother, knew God. And then comes Timothy, the grandson and son, coming to know God. Some of us learned to pray because we heard mama pray. Some of us came to church because somebody brought us. Some of us learned worship by watching somebody else worship. And thank God for the people who introduced us to him. But there comes a point when introduction has to become relationship. Jacob had this problem. Genesis chapter 28. Jacob is running from home. He has deceived his brother Esau. His family is fractured. His future is uncertain. And somewhere between where he came from and where he was going, he lays his head on a stone and falls asleep, and God appears to him. But listen carefully to how God introduces himself. He says, I am the Lord God of Abraham, thy father, and the God of Isaac. Abraham's God, Isaac's God. Jacob knows the family testimony. He knows what God did for grandpa. He knows what God did for daddy. But Jacob does not know him yet like Abraham knew him. So Jacob wakes up and says, surely the Lord is in this place. And I knew it not. Think about that. God was there before Jacob knew he was there. And there are people who have been surrounded by God your whole life, but you haven't discovered him for yourself yet. You've been around church, around worship, around preaching, around prayer, but being around God is not the same as knowing God. You can live in a house with somebody who prays and never develop a prayer life. You can sit under powerful preaching and never develop conviction. You can inherit somebody's Bible, but you cannot inherit their relationship with God. At some point, Abraham's God had to become Jacob's God. And this is where faith becomes personal, because eventually life happens. You discover that your Christianity does not exempt you from pain. You can love God and still bury somebody. You can tithe and still face big financial needs. You can pray and still wait. You can worship and still cry. You can obey God and still end up in a storm. And suddenly, the God you've been singing about has to become the God you actually know. Because borrowed faith works wonderfully until you encounter your personal storm. It's easy to say, God is a healer when somebody else is sick. It's easy to say, God will provide when somebody else can't pay the bill. It's easy to say, trust God's timing when somebody else is doing the waiting. It's easy to shout, God is faithful when everything in your life makes sense. But then your name gets called, your family gets touched, your money gets funny, your body starts hurting, Your prayer seems unanswered, your door doesn't open, your plans fall apart. And suddenly, you don't need a God you've heard about. You need the God that you know. In 1 Samuel chapter 17, Goliath walks into the valley. Israel sees a giant. Saul sees an impossible battle. The soldiers, they see death coming. But David sees something completely different. David looks at Goliath and remembers a lion. And then he remembers a bear. Listen to David. The Lord that delivered me out of the paw of the lion and out of the paw of the bear, he will deliver me out of the hand of this Philistine. David isn't guessing. David has history. David has receipts. David can say, I have seen this God work before. And that's why David can walk into a valley everybody else is afraid of, because David isn't meeting God for the first time in front of Goliath. David met God when nobody was watching. He met God in the field. He met God with the sheep. He met God when the lion came. He met God when the bear came. And sometimes God lets you fight private battles because he's preparing you for public giants. You thought the lion was unnecessary. You thought the bear was unfair. But God knew there was a Goliath waiting down the road. And when Goliath arrived, David already knew his God. Listen, your history with God becomes ammunition for your next battle. That's why you need to remember. Remember what he brought you through. Remember what he provided for you. Remember the prayers that he answered. Remember the door that he opened. Remember the night you thought you would not survive. Remember when everybody counted you out. Because when your next giant starts talking, sometimes you have to answer him with your history. I have seen my God before. Now we have to go deeper, because it's one thing to know God when he delivers you, but can you still say you know him when he doesn't do what you expected him to do? In Daniel chapter 3, we learn about 3 Hebrew young men standing before King Nebuchadnezzar. The furnace is burning. The king gives them one final opportunity. Bow to him or burn. And they answer, our God whom we serve is able to deliver us from the burning fiery furnace. That's faith. And then they say, but if not, now that's relationship. Our God is able, but if not, we still won't bow. In other words, we know something about God that is bigger than what God does for us. That's mature faith. Immature faith says, I trust God because he will give me what I want. But mature faith says, even when I don't understand his hand, I still trust his heart. If he heals me, he's God. If I have to walk through recovery, he's still God. If he opens the door, he's God. If he closes the door, he's still God. If he answers tonight, he's God. If I have to wait another year, he's still God. Because my relationship with him is not built on whether he performs according to my expectations. I know him. And when you know somebody, you don't reinterpret their character every time you don't understand their actions. That's where some people lose their faith. They knew the God who delivers from furnaces, but they never learned the God who walks with you inside one. Because notice, God did not keep them from the furnace. God met them in it. King Nebuchadnezzar looks inside and says, didn't we throw just 3 men in there? I see 4. And sometimes the revelation of God that you're asking for can only happen inside the fire, the very fire that you're asking him to remove. There are revelations of God that prosperity won't teach you. There are things about God you will never learn on a mountaintop. There are dimensions of his character that only becomes visible in valleys. You don't really know him as provider until there isn't enough. You don't really know him as comforter until your heart is broken. You don't really know him as peace until everything around you is chaos. You don't really know him as keeper until something is trying to destroy you. You don't really know him as your restorer until something has been broken. And maybe, just maybe, some of the seasons you have been begging God to remove are the very seasons through which God is introducing himself to you. You keep asking, God, why am I here? And maybe he's answering, because there's something about me you cannot learn anywhere else. There is a God you meet in the valley. There is a God you meet in the midnight hour. There is a God you meet when the money runs out. There is a God you meet when friends disappear. There is a God you meet when prayer is the only thing you have left. And you come out saying, I knew he was God before, but I know him differently now. Nobody illustrates this better than Job. Job was a rich man, loses his wealth, his children, his health, his security. And for chapter after chapter, Job asks questions. Why? 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 But near the end of the book, Job says something incredible. I have heard of thee by the hearing of the ear, but now mine eyes see thee. Wait, Job already knew God. Job was righteous. He prayed, he sacrificed, he worshiped. But after everything he went through, Job essentially says, before this, I had heard about you. Now I have seen you. Pain introduced Job to a dimension of God that prosperity never did. And I wonder if somebody can look back over your own life and say, I wouldn't choose that season again, but I know God differently because I went through it. I wouldn't choose the heartbreak. I wouldn't choose the betrayal. I wouldn't choose to go through the loss again. I wouldn't choose the lonely nights. I wouldn't choose the tears. But somewhere in the middle of all those things that tried to destroy me, I discovered something about God. Think about Peter. Peter knew Jesus as teacher. Then one day, the boat started sinking, and Peter discovered Jesus could command the sea. Peter knew Jesus as miracle worker. Then he stepped out of the boat and discovered Jesus could make impossible things walkable. Peter knew Jesus as Messiah. Then Peter denied him 3 times and discovered something else. He discovered Jesus as a restorer. And maybe that was the Jesus Peter needed to know the most. Because it's one thing to know God can heal sickness. It's another thing to discover God can restore you after you failed him. Peter cursed. Peter denied him. Peter said, I don't know the man. And after the resurrection, Jesus finds Peter not to embarrass him, not to destroy him, not to throw him away. He asks, Peter, do you love me? And the man who failed becomes the man who preaches at Pentecost. 3,000 souls were saved. That's the God that I know. A God who doesn't just use perfect people. A God who knows how to pick somebody up from their worst moment, restore their calling, restore their voice, restore their purpose, and say, my child, I am not finished. I'm not finished with you. Yeah. Now, Paul's words make sense when he wrote, I know whom I have believed. This isn't a young Christian speaking theoretically. This is a man who has been beaten, shipwrecked, rejected, imprisoned, misunderstood, abandoned. This is a man who prayed 3 times for something to leave, and God said no. And somehow, after all of it, Paul doesn't say, I think he's faithful. He says, I know. There's something about surviving with God that produces a different vocabulary. When you've never been through anything, you say, I believe God can. When you've walked through some things, you say, I know he can. Nobody can argue you out of what you've experienced. You can tell me God isn't faithful. Too late. I've seen too much. You can tell me prayer doesn't work. Too late. I've seen too much. You can tell me God can't restore. Well, too late. I've seen too much. You can tell me he won't provide. Too late. I have seen too much. Because maybe the question is not, why did God allow this? Maybe the question is, who is God revealing himself to be through this? Because every season has introduced you to another dimension of the same God. The season where you had nothing introduced the provider. The season where you were broken introduced the restorer. The season where you were afraid introduced the Prince of Peace. The season where you couldn't find your way introduced the shepherd. The season where everybody walked away introduced the friend that sticks closer than a brother. The season where you failed, that introduced God's mercy. The season where you couldn't forgive yourself introduced grace. The season you thought would bury you introduced the resurrection and the life. Maybe the enemy thought he was destroying you while God was introducing himself to you. So now, when somebody asks me, who is God? I don't have to give them somebody else's testimony. I can tell them, let me tell you about the God that I know. The God that I know has stayed with me when it wasn't easy to stay with. The God that I know has forgiven things I don't even like remembering. The God that I know has opened doors that I couldn't open. The God that I know has closed doors I was angry about until later I realized he was protecting me when he did. The God that I know has heard prayers I couldn't even put into words. The God that I know has carried me through seasons I thought would finish me. I don't know him just because everything went right. I know him because he remained my God when everything went wrong. Some of you are listening to this, knowing the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. You know your grandmother's God. You know your father's God. You know your mother's God. You know your pastor's God. But God brought you here because he wants to become the God that you know. Not secondhand revelation, not borrowed conviction, not somebody else's testimony. God wants history with you. And maybe that's why hell has fought you so hard, because every battle has given you another testimony. Every valley gave you another revelation. Every scar gave you another story. Every time hell said, this will finish you, God whispered, watch me. And now you can look back and say, that sickness, that's what taught me that God was a healer. That empty bank account, that's what taught me that he was a provider. That lonely season taught me he was my friend. That failure is what taught me he was merciful. That heartbreak is what taught me he was my comforter. That confusion taught me he was my shepherd. That midnight taught me he was still there. And that fire, oh, that fire taught me that sometimes God doesn't take you out. He gets in it with you. So I don't just know the God who parts the Red Seas. I know the God who walks through the furnace. I don't just know the God who kills giants. I know the God who strengthens shepherd boys. I don't just know the God who opens prison doors. I know the God who gives you a song while the doors are still locked. I don't just know the God of Sunday morning. I know the God of the Monday midnight. I know him when the music stops. I know him when nobody's clapping. I know him when the answer hasn't come. I know him when I don't understand. I know him when my feelings tell me he's gone because I've walked with him too long. I've seen too much. I've suffered too much to doubt him now. Somebody needs to hear this. You thought this season was proving that God had abandoned you. No. This season is introducing you to a different dimension of God. You are about to know something about God that you could never learn from somebody else's sermon. You'll never again have to say, my pastor told me he could. You'll say, I saw him do it. You'll never have to say, my mother said he would keep you. You'll say, he kept me. You'll never have to say, somebody testified that he provides. You'll say, I've eaten at his table. You'll never have to say, they told me he restores. You'll say, look at me. And after the storm, after the fire, after the valley, after the wait, after the tears, the questions, the night you almost quit, after the moments you wondered where God was, you will come out carrying something hell cannot steal, a history with God. And when the next Goliath walks into your valley, you won't panic because you'll remember the lion. You'll remember the bear. You'll remember the furnace. You'll remember the prison. You'll remember the midnight. You'll remember the last time you thought it was over and God showed. So devil, you're too late. You should have killed me before I learned who God was. You should have stopped me before I had history with him, because now I know too much. I've seen him make ways. I've seen him keep me. I've seen him restore. I've seen him provide for me. I've seen him forgive. I've seen him carry me. And you cannot make me doubt what I know. Paul said, I know whom I have believed. Job said, I heard about you, but now I see you. David said, the God who delivered me then will deliver me now. The Hebrew boy said, he is able, and if he doesn't, we still won't bow. And today I stand with them and declare, I don't just know about him, I know him. I've cried with him. I've waited on him. I've wrestled with him. I've questioned him. I've leaned on him. I've fallen before him. I've watched him make ways where there were no ways. I've watched him carry what I couldn't carry. I watched him keep me when I couldn't keep myself. And after everything I've been through, after every valley, after every disappointment, after every closed door, after every unanswered question, I can still lift my hands and say, he's been faithful. This is not the God that I read about. This is not just the God somebody preached about. This is not merely the God that my parents told me about. This is not merely Abraham's God or Isaac's God or Jacob's God or David's God or Paul's God. This is my God, and I know him. I know his mercy. I know his grace. I know his voice. I know his presence. I know his keeping power. And after everything life has thrown at me, I am still persuaded, for I know whom I have believed, and I am persuaded that he is able. So whatever tomorrow brings, whatever giant is waiting, whatever furnace gets heated, whatever door closes, whatever storm begins to rage, I already know who is coming with me. Because the God I once only heard about, through every battle, through every valley, through every tear, through every victory, through every failure, through every season, has become the God that I know. God bless you, and thank you for listening.